So Daniel, we're looking at iron ore, copper, and different commodities like this. It seems to signal some economic weakness coming up. What's fundamentally behind this weakness?
Well, I think that there are a number of factors behind the weakness of commodities, and particularly copper and iron ore. The first one is obviously, as you very well pointed out, is that we have seen peak growth. We have seen most of the strongest part of the recovery behind us. And I think that in terms of the purchases of iron ore and copper, which are good bellwethers of industrial production, are signals that industrial production, that manufacturing in general is cooling down. But it's also showing that the elevated levels of prices that were in the market into May, most of them are actually keeping the stronger part of the support level. So on the one hand, what we see is peak growth. We see that there's an economic slowdown. It is pretty evident, for example, in the industrial production figures of the United States, in the retail sales, in consumer confidence as well. So all of these factors, as well as the Chinese slowdown, are behind the relative weakness of commodities that we have seen recently. And we cannot forget the tapering effect. The Fed has signaled the possibility of starting tapering its purchases, and that tends to put pressure on the more cyclical assets, including commodities.
When we look at the PMIs month to month, even the recent ones, one of the big complaints, I think the major complaint is a labor shortage. And we have
Yeah.
big clothing companies in America emailing their people, their customers, telling them there's labor shortages, not just in America, but seems to be across the globe. Is this a significant drag on growth and the recovery, do you feel?
Certainly, and particularly because it's artificially created. Basically, what we saw is that governments in economies, but also in emerging economies, have kept very strong subsidies to people to keep them out of the labor force, and it's taking more time than expected to bring them back into the labor force because many of these subsidies were maintained for a longer period of time than was necessary. We have seen it, for example, in the European Union, where there are still 6 million furloughed jobs. We have seen it in the United States, where the stimulus checks were still there very recently. Therefore, there is, on the one hand, there is a very low labor participation rate because the services sector has not recovered as strongly as expected. But at the same time, there are labor shortages in the manufacturing sector because of these misguided subsidies, or at least maintaining them for a prolonged period of time, certainly longer than they were necessary.
And although these data points are quite recent with copper, etc., iron ore, etc., yourself and other top experts in the field have been warning that we would start to slow down as we got closer to the second half of the year and beyond. Why was that, and where else are you seeing drags on growth?
Well, it's in my opinion, it's basically that we see the diminishing effect of stimulus packages. Is that stimulus plans last less time, last the period of effectiveness is lower, and they have a lower impact as well on productivity growth and on the improvement of job creation. Basically, why? Because most of the stimulus plans are perpetuating overcapacity in some sectors while dragging the economy by increasing massively the debt of the non-productive sectors. No? So what we're basically seeing right now is like a hangover of the reopening. Most of the strong data points that we have seen in the past months came fundamentally from the reopening, not from the stimulus packages. No, and once the reopening is in full-fledged, once the population has adjusted to the vaccinations and the improvement in the economy in general, what we see is that there's a tremendous lag on the overall economy. That manufacturing, for example, in the United States, industrial capacity utilization is 4% below the average of 1972 to 2020. So we're talking about a big slump in industrial capacity utilization at the same time as businesses are talking about shortages and supply chain disruptions. What does this tell us? It tells us that businesses do not believe that the inflationary pressures and that the growth in the economy are going to last for a long time. And therefore, what they are not going to do is to enter into the so-called death by working capital, which is what they tend to do in other periods of crisis, is that businesses see the false demand signals from big stimulus plans, increase their inventories, increase production, then they're left with excess capacity and they enter into a much more severe slowdown. So I think that what we're seeing right now simply is the hangover of the recovery plus the stimulus plans and the very poor effectiveness of those stimulus packages.
And so, what are your predictions for the next 12 to 24 months? And if stimulus plans aren't the answer, what do you recommend to policymakers when you speak with them?
Well, we had a discussion recently with Ms. Judy Shelton in which both of us agreed that what policymakers have to do right now is to let the economy breathe, that stimulus plans are working against the recovery because they're dragging on job creation, because they're dragging on improvement of productivity, because they're increasing debt on the sectors with overcapacity, while at the same time leaving the sectors of high productivity in a much weaker situation. So right now is exactly the moment for policymakers to let the economy breathe, to allow the economy to start rebuilding properly, because what they have ignored is that all of the productive capacity, the majority of the productive capacity of the global economy was completely untouched and during COVID-19. Therefore, the risk of creating a bubble while at the same time letting the economy drag is much worse than allowing the economy to simply work as it does with improvements in productivity and lower stimulus plans, which are fundamentally directed to bloating government spending, which means higher deficits, higher taxes, lower growth in the future.
Interesting. Daniel Lacalle, Tresses, thank you.
Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.